Hello and welcome to our webinar. Today we have a really exciting topic, and without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. She is the head of cyber advisory services for SpearTip, which is a company of Zurich Resilient Solutions. They've been a CII member for a very long time. We're super excited to have them with us, sharing their knowledge and expertise on this topic. Nikki Ingram is going to go ahead and tell you more about how to keep your project safe. We're pleased to have her with us. And again, we will take your questions at the very end. Nikki, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. So as Jenny did a quick introduction, my background in cybersecurity comes from a combination of military law enforcement, physical security through the Navy, and in the brilliance of the military, my bachelor's of science was in electrical engineering technology. And when I enlisted, they said, it has a battery, congratulations, now your problem. So got into cybersecurity there and then got my master's of science in cybersecurity. So when speaking, there will be a couple sections that specifically around like physical security, which construction has a heavy overlap with, that I can speak quite heavily to, unlike a lot of our IT background cybersecurity specialists typically have experience with. So that being said, quick little touch point on some of our agenda items, a little bit around what construction is dealing with perspective to out in the threat landscape, exploring some of the specifics with regards to regulations, insights on how to conduct risk assessments and identifying the vulnerabilities and threats within the construction industry, and then discussing the critical components for establishing a robust cybersecurity strategy that's tailored to your specific organization's needs. So with regards to the types of threat actors out there, I don't look to drain any of the slides here, so please, by all means, do drop your questions in. Like Jenny said, I'll answer them at the end, or happy to answer them, offline, and you'll get a copy of these slides. But with construction, a lot of the target cyber criminals and insider threats. Digging into the cyber criminals, these are threat actors that are profit motivated. These are groups or individuals. We hear, groups like Conti and Play. Currently, a group that's getting a lot of publicity is Scattered Spider. Some of these groups, threat actor organizations, they'll sit there and they'll target a particular industry, or they'll just look for a particular type of vulnerability. They all have their particular style or tactics that they use for how they approach going about their area within the cyber threat landscape. Are they looking for, initial attack vectors? Are they looking for ways to create payloads and type of attacks and the malware that they'll, get exploited out? It's a whole business operation. So when you're talking cyber criminals, that's the really big threat motivation within the construction industry. And then the insider threats, this comes into two main categories. You've got your malicious insiders and incautious insiders. I would say more often than not, it tends to be incautious insiders. And this isn't always, motivated by somebody who's trying to make a mistake, or that there's anything wrong. It's just that, we see all the security awareness training, the phishing emails. Now we're getting into voice or phishing type of attacks. That one's on the rise again. The text messages and all these other style of social engineering attacks. And all it takes is for an employee to just have one inattention. And also your incautious insider is that employee who unintentionally becomes the way that a threat actor gets in. Or a really common one right now is, you think of the Chat GPT or these generative AI type of tools that can help somebody, frame up a nice way to say an email or some type of business. letter, but sharing that sensitive business information into an unapproved AI tool all of a sudden could be sharing your sensitive business information into a public domain that should not have gone. That's where that incautious insider all of a sudden became a potential threat actor. Again, it's not intended to be malicious. There's nothing inherently, mean behind it, but that inattentiveness, that failing the, social engineering only has to be wrong once. Threat actor has a lot more chances, out there, or, unintentionally using a tool that wasn't approved, didn't have the security controls in place. Obviously, you do have your malicious insiders who are, going to try to take advantage of, the organization, but that's probably a smaller percentage out there. We don't see that often in construction. I would say it's more the inattentive ones. The types of cyber attacks, again, there's a bunch out there. Distributed denial of service and denial of service. This one, I would say not a big one for construction, although we are seeing a fair bit of this recently, just as a whole across the, the threat landscape. Reason why it's not much for construction. Denial of service is something, one device getting too much traffic. Think of going into a project site and having only one gate open and everybody having to go through that same gate. Too much traffic through one gate, all of a sudden really slowed getting onto that project site. Distributed denial of service would be lots of people trying to go through all at once. So denial of service, one person holds up the gate. Distributed denial of service, lots of people hold up that one gate. Or another analogy would be car breaks down in the middle of an intersection versus rush hour traffic and all the cars trying to go through that same intersection. Distributed denial of service is typically referenced for like online traffic. If you're heavily reliant on web-based or your online website for business, then that might be a higher concern. But typically speaking, even if it's a more likely case, at one client I was working with, where this was actually a more likely scenario to be impacted by a distributed denial of service attack or a denial of service attack than a ransomware attack, interestingly enough. But the dollar amount impact to that was very negligible. It was like less than 10K, less than $10,000 type of impact to their organization if they had that sort of attack against them. Again, for construction, not as impactful, but we are seeing a lot more of that in that space. I talked on the social engineering. There's a lot within social engineering. It's tried and true because ultimately threat actors are people. They look to target people. All types of attacks look to get ultimately some type of user access, leverage their credentials, their type of access control, or their access rights, and then use that to then escalate and get to whatever their ultimate goal is, be it transferring funds or getting access to sensitive data or jumping onto another type of attack in like the more sophisticated supply chain attacks. Data breaches are on the rise. That's more so because ransomware, which is a type of malware, we're seeing there's not as much paying out of ransomware. And because encryption keys from the ransomware threat actors aren't being as reliable, that's kind of reinforcing less payouts for the threat actors, as well as there's also sanctions if you pay. If you pay to, or engage with the wrong threat actor, and this gets into regulatory and why you should definitely involve legal, and our next session gets more into the incident response and the detection side, so I won't get too much into the response side of things. But the other big one in there is the AI-powered attacks. There is more use in that, but AI is also powered into a lot of defenses. So it's kind of a combination of it's making it easier for some type of attacks, but it's also helping in some of the defenses. So this here is just to give a little bit of a sense of the number of different ways that a threat actor has to come into the environment, the numerous types of access points. This is pulled from the Verizon DBIR. This was the 2024 numbers. I put this together, the 25 hadn't originally been released yet. You know, you've got email, direct install onto a device, remote access or the remote inject, backdoor in, we got phishing, stolen creds is your credentials. Ultimately, this just speaks to that when I talk to all those different cyber criminals out there, that's before you get into your state sponsored or, you know, who have lots of funding and all the time in the world. Your cyber criminals are looking for quick return on investment, and speaking in business terms, because they want to make money and move on to the next victim. They're going to be looking at for which of these attack access, you know, numerous access points, get them in, get them what they're looking for, and move on to the next victim. And because it's a whole business model, they may pay somebody to do that initial access, then they come in and take their step. And think of it like they've got their subs that work for their subs. So, you know, think of your general contractors and your subs. Same thing works in the cyberspace as well. So moving into the cyber governance, risk, and compliance here, as we get into the next slide, I pulled up some of the frameworks and regulations and standards that we see across cyber, and this is by no means all of them. These are just I would say, a majority of the main ones. Specifically, a couple of the ones that are in blue are the ones that we commonly see getting signed for, requested in a lot of the construction, CMMC. Now we have the 2.0 with CMMC. We see FedRAMP, NERC-CIP, ISO 27001, it's the cybersecurity one. We got a couple others down there. One that's not listed in the ISO category is also the one, I think it's the 27, or I can't remember the exact breakdown, but it's has to do with business continuity. I've been seeing that one pop up in the recent months, overlapping with business continuity plans in a couple requests. GDPR, that one might impact if you've got international business operations, and I'm sure a few of you are sitting there saying, but we don't collect data. You have employees. You have employee PII. That is sensitive information, and there may be other pieces of information that you collect that may fall into the GDPR, or you need to sit there and review. There may be contractors or subs that come on, claims info for workers' comp. If you have any type of that sort of worker safety, workers' comp type of activity, even one record for some of the different regulations could put you in scope. That's getting very fine detail. The HIPAA regulations, I think it's less than 500 records was the last time I looked at it. And that's, you have to know exactly how many records were impacted. So if you don't know, then it could be all records. Now, again, that's healthcare. Would that apply? Could. Again, you really got to talk to or look at what your contracts say, what sort of data you're holding. You know, if you're working on a medical facility, they may in the contracts that you sign have interesting compliance requirements to some of this. It may make for very easy compliance requirements because you don't hold the data, but knowing what data you have and where that data is will make compliance to these regulations and knowing how you're protecting the data if you do happen to have it much easier. So there's a bit of a breakdown between the governance, risk management, and compliance. Starting at the bottom, one thing to call out on the compliance piece is compliance is not the same thing as security. Good security supports compliance. However, compliance does not inherently support good security. For example, I will pick on retail briefly. Most organizations, and I say most because I'm sure there's some exception out there that I'm not aware of, But most organizations, or all of those that I am aware of, were PCI compliant at the time that they had a credit card data breach. Again, compliance is not the same thing as security. However, good security would help with compliance. It doesn't say compliance is bad, but compliance is also a snapshot in time. Security, risk management, those are ongoing activities. I'm sure all of you will sit there and say how much you enjoy OSHA, and that when OSHA comes through, they're doing at point in time assessments, but there is an expectation that you are maintaining the requirements and those safety and health and concerns for your workers ongoing, not just when that representative is there on site. Your risk management, one thing is, cyber is just another risk. I can talk about all the technical requirements and use all sorts of fun words, but ultimately, at the end of the day, cyber is just another risk. You mitigate it with controls, you eliminate it. So if you don't need to have healthcare information, don't have healthcare information. I have employees and there may be some requirement there, but don't keep credit card information. You don't have a credit card data security exposure. You do risk transfer in the form of cyber insurance where possible. And then there's the risk acceptance, which is, okay, this is what our organization can tolerate. I can insert any type of risk in there. Cyber just happens to be the one I know. So risk management, cyber should just be treated like any other type of risk your business is managing and should use the same rules. So if it's a critical level risk to your business, it should be treated the same way as any other type of critical level business. And that makes it far easier for you to understand across your organization to the level and severity of impact that that would have. Makes it much easier also for me as a cyber specialist to speak to the business organization and understand how much of an impact that that has. And they also then understand when I say, hey, this is critical, they know what that means from their perspective. So that common language really makes a difference. And then the governance piece really comes to having a structure and an accountability. When we get into the next section down in a few slides here, you'll really see why the governance has gotten an increasing amount of importance as the years have gone on, especially within cybersecurity, and the fact that it's not an area where it's easy to say, if you do this, you're going to prevent all cyber incidents, you're not going to have a bad day. It's not how it works with cyber. Cyber is a lot like weather in that you prepare, but what that preparation does, it helps you manage and mitigate. It doesn't completely eliminate all cyber risk. So I know one question that comes up a lot here is, and especially because I know how hard it is to manage cybersecurity and all of the different requirements, especially with working with lean teams, there are tools out there that do make this much more easier to manage. There are GRC tools that help with centralizing the data, tracking activities, facilitating reporting. This makes a lot of the framework and regulation mapping back and forth, because I'll call out NIST here in the next slide or two. But there's a lot of overlap between the different frameworks. Some will, go into more areas, but if you are good and do a comprehensive risk assessment, you can then map to the other frameworks. So when you do have to do any type of audit, or client or sits there and asks for, hey, can you prove this, or a vendor needs to have a, particular request, or you're doing vendor management and you want to make sure that they're complying with your needs, GRC tools make that a lot easier. You can do it via Excel and manual processes. I've done that. It is not nearly as much fun unless you're an Excel master, and that's just actuaries and don't appreciate it. Also, with us seeing things like the pixel tracking and some of these, Google Analytics and Metapixel, some of these other type of concerns that we see pop up. Again, construction, we don't typically think about that, but I know some of you've maybe gotten asked those type of questions. Some of these tools will also help you track some of those policies and or enforce some of those policies depending, which can really help with managing or just saying, I know what you're asking for. It is not a concern of ours because we don't track it. We don't get this. Or if you do, here's what we do with it. Here's where it proves we did our due diligence. And that's the biggest thing with a lot of these is being able to demonstrate and give evidence that you were completing and doing ongoing due diligence. So these tools are really just to give a helpful hint of, because this is a common one we get asked. So I said we'd do a deeper dive into one of the frameworks. The NIST CSF 2.0 is the one that we've used the most. So we'll skip on to the next slide here. The NIST CSF, or the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, is by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. This is an open source framework. It's based for all critical infrastructure. It used to be 5, now it is 6. They specifically carved out governance or govern. It used to be part of identify. It was identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Now it's govern, and then the other 5 stayed the same. It used to be 23 factors. Now it's 22. So mostly it all stayed the same. The only one that kind of got changed around, I mean, mostly shuffled around. Nothing really dropped out. Nothing really got added in. It was mostly, so pretty much for the most part, it all stayed the same. It was mostly just reorganizing, highlighting what needed a little bit more attention. It got a little bit more neutral. Before it was very clearly for critical infrastructure. Now, because it's so widely used by industry, they made it more business open friendly versus how before it was very government focused. For those of you who have a military background, it seems very similar to the ORM, or Operational Risk Management Framework. Again, it's a risk management type based framework. So this does not go into specific technical specifications for each of these, but it does talk to the overall, okay, how would you manage asset management? It then cross-references to the other NIST policies and standards that would sit there, specifically the NIST 800-53, which gets into technical controls. A lot of organizations will use NIST CSF 2.0, and then we'll combine that with like ISO 27001. One thing that's really important is what you choose as an organization to use as a risk management framework should be something that you document and frame out so that you can then use the same risk management framework for assessing your risks on an ongoing basis in a repeatable manner. Using a industry standard framework is great, but it is by no means a necessity. Many organizations out there will use a combination or a hybrid that they've found, taking this and then adding in additional, areas that make sense for your business is perfectly fine and speaks a lot to your due diligence. Even as a small organization, a 40-person, general contractor located in the state of Florida, this is a straightforward, easy to use framework. You don't have to do anything fancier than that. That's perfectly fine, and it'll get you exactly what you need, and that works. You can be a multi-billion-dollar international contractor and use the NIST CSF 2.0 and reference to all the -53 controls and be just as effective. Again, insert a different framework, and if it meets your needs, then that's the right framework. Looking into, on the next slide here, some of the controls. These are when looking at some strategic guidance, the top controls, I put some boxes around some of the ones I'm going to dive here in the next couple slides. And segmentation, specifically physical and digital, vulnerability scanning, which I'll touch on also, penetration testing, and then around the resiliency side, the business continuity and disaster recovery here. So for vulnerability assessments versus penetration testing. So I mentioned that as the head of the advisory team. So my team does all of the proactive services. So we do everything from consulting to, my team has the penetration testers on it, to vulnerability assessments, to writing plans and policies, which is great. Part of my team is the penetration testing, which is the ethical hackers. I get to constantly go ruin my other teams, meaning my colleagues, and the monitoring and the forensic side of the house's day. I also do the vulnerability assessment. So this is an area where we get to see firsthand the difference between these, but it's also an area where there's a lot of confusion out there in the market space and across organizations on these two areas. It's also, a lot of my clients are in construction, that these two have a lot of positive impact in helping on your security programs. I'll start with vulnerability assessments. Vulnerability assessments are scanning systems and networks to identify known vulnerabilities. Think of these as weaknesses. Or if you ask my penetration tester, think of this as changing the oil for your car. The key features is this is observational. It's automated scanning tools. Nessus Qualys are two types of tools in that space. Reports are potential weaknesses, typically based on the version. It doesn't take into account if it's internal, so within your firewalls, or external, facing the public or the web. Typically no attempt to exploit. I say typically. Some of the next gen, newer type of vulnerability assessments do try some basic level of like, oh, what can I do with this? Usually conducted on a regular cadence. They should be. Monthly is kind of the, I would say, preferred regular cadence. I would not do less than quarterly. And that's for both internal, so within your firewalls, externally, outside of your firewalls. Some companies will think of internal as in your own team does this, and external as in a third party does that. That's one of the common misconception or terminologies I see with that one. Some organizations, and like best in class, great, would be to do this continuously or weekly within reason. And then the other thing is that vulnerability assessments does not provide for likelihood of a breach or potential outcome. So it doesn't speak to anything other than here's a weakness. That's it. That's all it speaks to. Has to get updated. The severity is based on a number of different factors. There's industry boards, can go into a whole conversation around vulnerability assessments. You do that for cloud, you do that for web applications, mobile applications, your network. Vulnerability assessment. On the other hand, you have penetration testing. Now this is where you have the human sits there and they will go and actively attack the network with the goal being to compromise the system and accounts. And depending on what ultimately is their end goal, it could be in simulating, can they get into the data source? Can they exfiltrate data? Is it just a matter of, can they get to a specific area? Can they manipulate something? Penetration testing can get very broad. It can be very narrow scoped. It can be, can I impact just headquarters, or could I go from all your project sites? The ability to impact one project site and then jump from that project site to another project site. when you're thinking, oh, each project site is completely separate, doesn't, they're totally fine, it's not a problem, and a penetration tester comes in and proves that, oh, well, if I get into this trailer, I can't do anything, but if I go into the trailer at the project site that's over in New Mexico, and I can get everywhere, well, that may make a really big difference because there might be something that's configured differently, and that's where that penetration testing makes a difference. The vulnerability assessment wouldn't detect that. So these are interactive. There's 0 theoretical scenarios. The findings have been exploited successfully. So it's kind of proving, is this a real vulnerability or is it just a, yeah, it's there, but it can't be done. Nothing can be done with it. Simulates expected outcomes of the breach. Attacker attacks the users, the systems, accounts, and gains access to data likely to be held in ransom. Again, it's doing a live controlled attack on the environment. Same as with vulnerability assessments, they could be inside the network, outside the network, it could be on the cloud environment, web applications, on your website, your mobile applications. It's all a matter of where you want to. Now, one thing in this particular area is that you're seeing AI or automated penetration testing. There are very few true effective automated penetration testing that is more than just advanced vulnerability assessments at this time of me saying this right now. So take this session when it's recorded and fast forward a couple months, this may be completely different. By the time of this, there's very few of those. For external, they're more ahead than for internal. So automated penetration testing for external may be more valuable and saving you to manage your budget for internal human penetration testing if you have a restricted budget, because I know for some organizations that are smaller, that's a really difficult thing because human penetration testing certainly can be affordable, but when compared to the AI penetration testing, I can tell you right now that's the easiest giveaway when you're looking at price is if it seems low, probably because it's been automated. Again, not that it necessarily is a bad thing, but what are you trying to achieve? And is that meeting exactly what you're looking for? Is it just what comes out of a vulnerability assessment? Or are you looking to see, hey, is this really going to be exploited? Can it really do what it's looking for? That's my soapbox on the penetration testing. Like I said, I've got both on my team. They both serve their purpose. I won't touch too much on this one. I threw it in as a little fun exercise just to break up all the boring cyber talk. These are the most common passwords for all countries, and then I picked a couple other ones. I also looked up Japan, and I think they also had the same thing, password and 1, 2, 3. I can't remember which order that was in. And then this was how long it took for decrypting passwords based on length and complexity. So really, this was just a fun statistic I like to throw in just to break up the monotony of some of the text. Briefly on this one, this is, and we're talking about risk assessments. The other group that you should be doing risk assessments on is your supply chain and specifically third-party risk management. And for that is looking at, conducting risk assessments based on how critical they are and how much access they have to what's sensitive or critical to your operations. So example being, if they're your BIMS provider and they're providing the key cloud system or they're critical to your operations, doing a risk assessment for them so that a event that they're impacted by a cyber attack or something is really important in understanding, are they going to impact you having a bad day? That tiering speaks to, are they critical as in high? Are they a high risk to you? So they have access to a lot of information. So if they get hacked, could that threat actor then get into your sensitive information, you think of leveraging third parties for helping with IT, helping with cybersecurity. Again, running small teams, keeping talented cybersecurity staff can be expensive. It can also be difficult to just maintain and keep from an education skill set piece. It's a small, pool of people. I know I gotta manage this group. So leveraging third parties is a great strategy for some organizations. So third parties is a perfectly good idea. But that's where managing third parties, managing your supply chain is really important. I did want to point out the supply chain versus a third party specifically just because the difference of those. Supply chain goes for both up and down, where third party is a little bit more narrow scope. So this is not employees or customers when you're talking third party, and it's not talking fourth party, which is the suppliers of your suppliers, where supply chain can be many layers up and down from you, but the process and the whole chart applies for both supply chain and your third party risk management. Now we get into a fun one, and this is really particular with construction, and that's convergent security when it comes to respect to physical and cybersecurity. You've got comprehensive threat detection and response. This is combining both physical and cybersecurity measures in organizations to respond to threats. You've got holistic view, so also you're getting sensors that are speaking to somebody walking onto a project site. Think about, this could be protecting access to the server room from my perspective with the cybersecurity side, but that could also be somebody going into a high risk area where you're about to be doing maybe some hot work or other type of high risk construction type work. Or you've got the classic case, I love the story about trying to manage, what do you do for all these thrill seekers, although I haven't heard as many, maybe they're still doing it, pretty sure they're still doing it, all these Instagram, social media, insert your colorful language, that want to go climbing tower cranes or other type of, building frames to take photos or videos and things like that. That physical security aspect and cybersecurity aspect do overlap. The risk management process of identification and assessment and mitigating risks, you're all speaking the same language. You're looking at threats. You're looking at intelligence around. So is there increased activity? There may be, when we're talking like hacktivists, we didn't touch too much on this group, but if there's hacktivist activity because you're working on a particular type of project, say oil pipeline through a nature area, that not only may get you protests at the physical perspective, but it may get you hacktivists and cyber type of attacks where they're going to look to do attacks on your network or deface your website or other types of cyber events because of a type of project. So where the overlay between cybersecurity and your physical security could have some intersection. Also, if I can do a manipulation on getting your employee information, so I can replicate a badge and then walk easier onto your site by flashing a badge that looks like a regular employee or credentials, or slapping a sticker on the side of a truck to drive on and steal a bunch of copper wire because I look like I belong there versus trying to, sneak in like a blank truck or something like that. I'm increasing my likelihood of being more successful in my attacks. Again, I'm a simple creature. I come from military law enforcement. Unified security policies, just as I spoke to cyber as any type of risk, cybersecurity, physical security, they're all security. It's all about layered defense approaches. So when you're looking at a unified approach, consistent policies, procedures, there's a whole section referenced in the NIST CSF, which then overlays to the -53 controls around physical security. So even the cybersecurity frameworks know that there's a whole section specific on physical security. So those unified policies, you don't have to do double the work when one policy can meet multiple needs. And again, your streamlined access control, why have two sets of badge access when your physical access, your digital access can be one? Again, simple. You don't have to recreate multiple methods. You can have one management system and meet multiple needs. Here's a whole listing of types of physical security controls. Fun note, there's a whole bunch of these that will overlap with a whole bunch of those cybersecurity controls. Again, I'm not going to sit there and get over all of these. There's, a number of them that you wouldn't typically see me calling out on a cybersecurity call because they're pretty, they're not normal for a normal cybersecurity type, but especially within construction, I'm sure a number of these look a lot more familiar to you than some of my cybersecurity called out ones. But again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So incident response, business resiliency. I'll skip over these two pretty quickly. The main section is around disaster recovery, business continuity planning. Specifically, everyone loves to say, we've got plans, we don't really need to write down plans. And it's a common one I get told all the time. I worked with a small construction company back in November of 2019. They had an IT vendor who said, I know all the steps that they're going to take. Why do they need to write down a plan? I was like, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put you on a plane and send you to Bora Bora. I love sending everyone to Bora Bora. It's my thing. Some of my compatriots like to hit people with buses. Just what we do. That particular, it doesn't have to be long, it doesn't have to be complex, but if your server's unavailable because of a ransomware attack, your server's unavailable because of a fire, your server's unavailable, what are you going to do to keep your business up and running? How are you going to recover from that server being unavailable so that owner who spent 30 years building this organization can come back and that business is still operating? At the start of COVID, that owner called me up and sat there and said, thank you. Because of that conversation, they looked at their business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans, and had started drafting them and had upped their VPN or their virtual private network, their ability to work remote. Now, mind you, this is 2019 going into 2020. What happened about that time? Everybody had to go remote because of good old COVID. I should have bought a lottery ticket because he called me up to say thank you. They had upped their VPN capabilities, which meant they were able to go straight to an all remote operation with very little hiccup because they had started down the path of a business continuity disaster recovery plan. Again, you don't have to slap the word cybersecurity in front of it. You can. Don't have to sit there and have multiple plans. It could just be labeled as crisis management plan. You could have them separated out. Seen it done both ways. It all makes sense to whatever fits your business. But people will panic. Having a plan written down makes a huge difference. The point I want to get on this one is the business impact analysis. This will also be on the next slide too. And if you look, it says risk assessment for business continuity. Funny, we just spent a good chunk of time talking about risk assessment. Business impact analysis, I will sit there and say construction is not alone in not having a good job at talking to a business impact analysis. Many organizations I talk to do not have current or recent business impact analysis. The point of those is to know what systems are critical, which business units make, what type of money, which days of the week, or how long could you be down for what amount of hours. Example being, if you're running paychecks on the 15th, then your HR system and finance system being down on the 15th when those paychecks get cut, probably pretty critical. It being down on the 16th may not have the same level of impact. It's a problem, but it's not going to be as harmful as it would on the 15th, because employees get really upset if you don't pay them. But right after payroll ran, you may have a little bit more grace period to fix it than if it's delaying getting paid. That's where that business impact analysis comes in really handy. It also speaks to recovery time objectives, so how long you can be down before you start seeing an impact of, are you even going to be in business the next day? Your RPO, recovery point objective. How much data can you lose? This may be dictated by your contracts. So that business impact analysis makes a huge difference in that. When we talk to the disaster recovery, you'll see the first two are the exact same thing we just spoke to. Business continuity is how you keep the business running. Disaster recovery is how you get it back to how it's supposed to be. That's why there's a lot of overlap between these two and why a lot of times they get blended into the same thing. Like I said, I don't want to drain too much into this section. The next presentation we do, we'll get into this whole topic, same thing on the tabletop exercises, but this is a really important section, really comes into the preparation section. So same thing, make sure you test. Really briefly, CMMC, you'll see you go from level 3 to 1, goes from 110. Oh, look, it references NIST. And again, 171, 17. This is geared specifically around data. So again, we spoke to you how compliance doesn't talk to all of cybersecurity or all security. CMMC references NIST. So by using like NIST CSF, it can help with CMMC compliance. There is a lot of work going towards CMMC. I will sit there and say, complete session around this is that be cautious. It is more complex than people expect, and it is not cheap having to go through the certification and not being prepared prior to going into it. So for those who've stuck around, I will go into the really easy way of how to make sure you tailor your risk assessment and needs to yourself. I spoke a whole bunch of cyber terminology, and now I'm going to speak in a whole bunch of business terms that my colleagues in the cyberspace don't understand. Risk quantification is essentially trying to help quantify what is more of a qualitative type of risk. This is helping to define the risk and exposure of relevant cyber threats and scenarios facing your business. A risk quantification simulation engine that can help directly monitor the impact and implementation of those controls, and then helps prioritize and justify your cyber defense and investment plans. What it means is helps you understand your cyber risk, justifying your budget, and prioritizing your controls, because it takes all of that cyber speak and puts it into business terms, puts it into dollars, and now suddenly you speak a business language and not a cyber language. The data that feeds all into this comes from all of those technical terms, all that threat insights that I spoke about, all of the insights from the industry, insurance data, cybersecurity controls, threat insights from the dark web. They put this through statistical modeling, attack frameworks. There's different industry approaches to this. We do this for our clients, and it converts that risk into financial terms. And then you can see there on the backside what this means. It helps expresses it in minimum, maximum losses, likelihood, frequency. I live in Florida. I love it when we get spaghetti models for all the hurricanes. Now you can sit there and start talking about, likelihood and frequency when it comes to types of ransomware attacks. That's how I spoke about the DDoS frequency being higher, the likelihood being higher than a ransomware from one of the clients I worked with. That was a construction company. They had good controls, which meant their ransomware was managed appropriately, even though if they did get hit with ransomware, it's going to have a higher, loss expectation, but the likelihood of them being impacted was lower, where the higher likelihood of DDoS, but the impact of that was much lower. That's a way for them to manage their risk in a very straightforward, effective way. And so by approaching it from a quantitative method, allows for them to tailor their risk to a method that's very tailored to them. And again, puts it in the business terms versus trying to keep it to all technical terms. So I get asked a lot about what all goes into this. The loss magnitude, it's a little bit more straightforward on that one. Size, industry, where you're located, where you operate, your industry class, all of that feeds into this. The loss event frequency, that can change a lot, can change by threat actor activity, the types of vulnerabilities that are out there, your controls that are in place, the controls that you're changing. So as you improve in a particular area, that's going to change your frequency and your likelihood, the probabilities in there. So that's a far more moving target. It will also impact the magnitude, but that does mean that you can see remarked changes, but it does mean it can also, you can be seeing improvement and then you can slide backwards. It doesn't mean you got worse in how you're protecting. It just means threat actors may have reapproached something, changed their tactics, and have found a way around controls that you have. That's why it's an ongoing, constant strategy about this. It's also, is it something where also your vendor became a problem, or the vendor of that vendor, that fourth party risks, and all that gets rolled up into managing that risk. So finally, just kind of close the loop back around, considerations for organizational risk. Posing those questions back to you, like I said, we started off with thinking about cyber risk, and now we're looking at it from wrapping it up on the financial side. Instead of going all those technical ways of approaching it that I started with, I can apply those same questions, but now put them from a risk quantitative lens of, is my IT infrastructure secured? Looking at it from, okay, test it with the penetration testing. What would be the cost of a data breach or ransomware attack? That's where the risk quantification piece comes in. So now when you do a risk assessment and you look at how does it fit into your strategy, that's where when you're looking at putting together a program, you do your due diligence and then you look for finding a way to do your evidence or testing it. And that's how you sit there and make sure that your cybersecurity program makes the most sense for your organization. Excellent. And this is just a recap of the key takeaways that we started with. So with that, Jenny, do we have any questions, or I can pop up with a couple I know come up?
Let's take a peek right now. I don't have any sitting in the lobby waiting. I'm sure we'll get some going as we continue chatting, though. We've got about 5 more minutes.
Yep. So one question I know that comes up while people pop in questions is, do I see differences within, like from general contractors to some of the other groups within construction? Yes, there is some differences. A lot of that has to do with specific areas within the business. Same thing with like regional, that makes a big difference too. A lot around business email compromise, but some of the data, especially with what you see out there publicly, is often skewed by, one, what publicly gets announced is take with a grain of salt because some it has to be reported. And also the data source, and this is why I always look at multiple data sources, is like a data breach site is going to have data breach statistics. A site that tracks like ransomware responses, because that's what they do, will track ransomware statistics. So I tend to look at multiple ones of them. I'm fortunate working for an organization I do because I get to see both from an insurance perspective as well as from our response side, and then working directly with clients. So that's how I get to see it. Yes, on the question of, is there a difference between like some of the different groups within construction? We do see some differences. A lot of that has to be with just what exactly is the motivation for the threat actor.
Wonderful. I think you've primed the pump. Here come the questions, Nikki. With our organization growing and utilizing more and more third-party providers, utilizing cloud-based applications like Procore, M365, etc., what do you think is the best way to handle risk management and disaster recovery with regards to data breaches, cyber attacks, and outages on those systems?
So with regards to third-party risk management, see if I keep these all in order. Doing like I said, onto the one side, a cyber risk assessment and tiering them as far as their criticality. And this goes in I'm gonna do a matrix of them. So combination of, do they have access or are you using them for critical information? So if there was a data breach, do they have critical or sensitive information? Because that's going to make a big difference on, do you have to do reporting? Are you going to be having to notify clients, etc.? And then, is this critical to your operations? So if there's downtime, can you operate with them being unavailable for a certain amount of time? You may be able to have a local copy. Locally, a lot of cloud vendors, the level of redundancy that they have available is based on the level of your contracts. I've worked with a number of different ones, a couple of them you listed. They've got some really good offerings in there, and that's where when you do that risk assessment, you say, okay, here's what service they're providing, what do I need from a business perspective? And then you say, okay, what's my compensating control? So if I need you to have a certain level of redundancy or ability to keep operating, what do I do? Is it something they provide? Is it something another vendor provides? Is it something you keep yourself within your organization? And then on the data pieces, this goes with all frameworks. You as an organization are always responsible for your own data. And that's where making sure you know the security controls and are encrypting and managing your data, regardless of if you store it in a cloud vendor or not, is really important.
Wonderful. I think we have time for one more. We have MS 365. Should we worry, or what are other ways to be safe?
So I'm vendor agnostic. All vendors have their pros and cons. The tools like Microsoft come with amazing cybersecurity capabilities. So work with your security team, IT team with making sure you take advantage of all their security features and capabilities. Educate your employees, and just like any other risk out there, it's a tool. I know plenty of companies that are very successful in managing it on-prem or in the cloud. It's totally fine.
Wonderful. Thank you for these helpful tips, Nikki. We are going to have another webinar with Nikki, a follow-on, a deeper dive on the same topic. So we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next CII webinar. Hopefully we will see many of you in Nashville at the end of this month at the CII conference. Nikki, thanks again for your advice, your tips, very important topic, and we look forward to diving into it again.
Absolutely. Everyone have a good day.
Thank you all. Be safe. Take care.